So in 2018, Fidelity did something that had never been done before. They came out with 4 free index funds.
Kindness is free.
I'll say that again, free index funds. So what that means is that you don't pay any expense ratio or any fees when you buy any one of their 4 funds.
Nothing.
They're called the Fidelity Zero funds. So what's the catch?
What's the catch?
There is no catch.
Are they actually free, and are they actually a good idea to invest in? You also may be curious to know how they compare to other low-fee funds.
Well, then let's compare.
If you don't mind, stick around with me. We will take a closer look at all that and more. Fidelity for years now has always had to compete with companies such as Vanguard, as Vanguard has been known to carry, the lowest cost index funds and ETFs on the market. So when I first heard about these, I asked myself, how could this be possible? How does Fidelity make money if these funds are actually free?
It's actually free.
And that actually reminds me that we do have another video about Fidelity index funds that have a small fee to them as opposed to these completely free ones that we're talking about today. So go ahead, click that link above. I'll leave a link here so that you can go ahead and check that out. All right, anyway, let's rewind a bit because some of you may still be wondering, what I'm talking about when I say Fidelity Zero funds. I'll put them on the screen for you to see yourself. Here are the 4 Fidelity Zero funds, along with, a brief description of what they track. As you can see, there's one tracking the total stock market, one tracking large cap stocks, one tracking small to mid cap stocks, and finally one tracking international stocks. One thing I noted, and one thing that I think you should take note of, is that these 4 funds aren't actually tracking an index.
Damn, are you tracking my phone?
What they are tracking, however, are proprietary indexes that Fidelity actually created themselves. So that means, for example, that the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Index Fund does not actually track the S&P 500 as you might expect it to. That said, as we will soon find out, this may or may not be of a concern to you because you might find that these are still very similar in the companies that the funds track. But anyway, back to talking about whether or not these funds are free. So after some extensive research, we determined that these Fidelity Zero funds are absolutely free in regards to expense ratio, and if bought on the Fidelity brokerage platform, you do not have any transaction fees as well.
None at all.
That said, most platforms have moved to the no transaction fee model, but with every other fund besides the 4 I'm going to share with you today, there is an expense ratio, which basically in simple terms means there's a small percentage taken out of the returns for managing the fund.
But they do need something.
Now, after clearing all that up, or at least trying to, let's get into some of the details of each of the Fidelity Zero Index funds. I'm going to first detail the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Index Fund, ticker symbol FNILX. This fund tracks the Fidelity US Large Cap Index. The index is a float-adjusted market capitalization weighted index. In layman's terms, it tracks companies based on the number and value of the shares outstanding in the market. Its focus is on the US large cap equity market. The index is similar to the S&P 500 index, but there are some differences that I'll mention later when we compare this fund to the S&P 500 index Fidelity also offers. Let's take a look at the returns. Definitely can't complain about its 1, 3, and lifetime annual return. Remember, these funds have only been around since 2018, so we don't have a ton of data to look at to get a true picture of what this fund has done over a long period of time. As we look at the composition of the fund, you can see it is heaviest in information technology, healthcare, consumer discretionary, and financials. The top 10 holdings are companies you definitely have heard of, and that makes sense because this fund is, as we mentioned earlier, comprised of the largest market cap companies in the United States. Now let's take a closer look at the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund, ticker symbol FZIPX. This fund tracks the Fidelity US Extended Investable Market Index. It's designed to track US mid and small cap stocks. It's a subset of the Fidelity US Total Investable Market Index, excluding the 500 largest companies. Maybe the closest comparison of this index is the Dow Jones US Completion Total Stock Market Index. The main difference is that the Fidelity Index is limited to 2,500 companies, whereas the Dow Jones Index has just under 3,500 companies. Top 10 companies may not be as familiar, especially when compared to the large cap companies you saw in FNILX. Also take a quick look at the annual performance of 1, 3, and lifetime of the funds. Third, let's get into some specifics on the Fidelity Zero Total Market Index Fund, ticker symbol FZROX. This fund tracks the Fidelity US Total Investable Market Index, and this index is effectively a combination of the large cap and extended market index described above. As such, it is limited to 3,000 companies. Its closest comparison is the Dow Jones US Total Stock Market Index. It's not an exact match, however, as the Dow Jones Index tracks nearly 4,000 companies. Go ahead and take a look at this fund's composition and top holdings. And finally, I'll give you a second to just browse the 1, 3, and lifetime annual performance of the fund. We'll look at that in a little bit as compared to the other total stock market index fund. Finally, I want to examine the Fidelity Zero International Index Fund, ticker symbol FZILX. This fund tracks the Fidelity Global, excluding the US, index. Fidelity designed this index to track mid and large cap companies headquartered outside of the United States. The index is created by selecting the top 90% of stocks as measured by market cap in each country. This index is similar to the MSCI ACWI excluding USA index. This index, however, holds about 4,700 companies, while the free version holds about 2,300 companies. Glance over the important metrics of this fund. You may be familiar with some of the international companies that you see in the top 10 holdings. As you view the performance, keep in mind that international funds oftentimes, now don't quote me on that, not every time, but oftentimes do not return quite as good of returns, so do not be discouraged. It's always a good reason to keep your portfolio diverse and add international exposure. Now that we took time to do a brief overview of each of the Fidelity Zero Index funds, let's look at how they compare to their fee-based funds, also from Fidelity. First, let's compare FNILX and FXAIX. FXAIX is the Fidelity 500 Index Fund. Remember, the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Index Fund, ticker symbol FNILX, was similar to an S&P index. Here's how FNILX and FXAIX compare. The expense ratio for FXAIX is 0.015%, which to put into perspective is 15 cents per $1,000 invested annually, and as we know, FNILX is 0%. The number of holdings are slightly different, with the Zero Index Fund having 518 different companies and the Fidelity 500 Index having 508 holdings, so there's not much of a difference. The top 10 holdings are literally identical, so take a look at that. And finally, when we compare performance, I'm going to focus on the 3-year because that's probably the best comparison, since the life average returns would not be accurately assessing performance, as one fund has only been around for a little over 3 years and FXAIX has been around since 1988. As you can see, the returns are very similar. Even though they are not completely the same, I don't think there's even enough difference to draw attention to it. Now let's compare FZIPX and FSMAX. FSMAX is the Fidelity Extended Market Index Fund. Now the expense ratio is 0.035%, which would be 35 cents per $1,000 invested annually. The number of holdings in the Zero Fund is 2,115, as opposed to the 3,650 holdings with FSMAX. That's almost 1,500 less companies that are represented in the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund, FZIPX, which is a lot, and I will be interested to see how the performance compares shortly. The top 10 holdings are different, as only 2 companies match up the same between the 2 funds, Airbnb and Snow. 4.64% of the top 10 holdings make up FZIPX, and 7.73% of the top 10 holdings make up FSMAX, another key difference. The performance is very similar when looking at the 3-year annual return, which we did say I would focus on, but if you look at the 1 year and year to date, there is more of a significant difference. I'm not going to speculate what I think attributes to those differences, and you'd probably have to really take a look at the companies represented between the two funds, but this is definitely something to maybe contemplate when choosing between the two similar but definitely different funds. Now, if you look at the FZROX and FSKAX, we're looking at two total stock market index funds. There is one major difference between the two, but the difference might not matter to you when you see how similar everything else is. The expense ratio is 0.015% for FSKAX, which is, as we mentioned earlier, that would be 15 cents per $1,000 invested annually. That's barely nothing, but more than FZROX, which is of course 0%. The number of holdings is where these two funds do drastically differ. The FZROX Zero Total Market Fund represents 2,631 holdings, and the FSKAX Total Stock Market Index Fund represents 3,964 holdings. The top 10 holdings, however, are virtually the same, as well as the total percentage of the portfolio that the top 10 holdings represent. The performance, which I think we can establish is the most important metric when comparing funds for these two, are practically identical. Certainly not enough difference to really discuss further. The last comparison is between FZILX and FTIHX. Sorry, mouthful there. Both of these funds represent international index funds. The expense ratio is 0.06%, which amounts to 60 cents per $1,000 invested annually. The number of holdings between these two funds differs drastically. The Zero Fund represents 2,386 holdings, and FTIHX represents 4,830 holdings. That's almost 2,500 less companies. The top 10 holdings are the same, although in a slightly different order. Performance, however, is very similar. Once again, as I look at it, there's not enough difference in the performance to draw attention to any one time frame that has been documented on the Fidelity site. One would have assumed that there would be, given the major difference in the amount of holdings. The top 10 was almost identical, and I guess carried enough market cap weight to cause these funds to perform similarly. So we looked at the 4 different Fidelity Zero funds and determined what they track. We then compared them to another Fidelity index fund that is very similar that tracks the actual index. With the exception of FZIPX and FSMAX funds, which were the extended market funds or the ones tracking small and mid-cap companies, we found the Fidelity Zero funds and the comparable Fidelity Small Expense Ratio funds to be very similar in nature, especially the most important metric everyone wants to know, which is performance.
Beautiful performance.
As a whole, the cost of index funds has come down over the years.
It's less expensive.
The funds we compared the Zero funds to were very low cost, with the highest expense ratio being 0.06%. In other words, 60 cents per $1,000 invested annually. That's not really much at all, but you can't beat zero, as the 4 funds I highlighted today actually are. You do have to remember though, these funds are tracking their own proprietary indexes, keeping management costs down. Now, as I always say, please do your own research before doing any investing. These are my views and opinions I've drawn after research, but these Fidelity Zero index funds have performed well and comparatively against the similar Fidelity funds we compared them to. The only concern I have for these funds is that they have not been around super long and do not have the proven track record like the other established funds. But I do not see any major issues scaring me away from investing in them. You can't beat free. Anyway, I hope you found value in this video. If you did, please smash the subscribe button, which is also free and really helps us out. Let's continue to make money simple, and I'll see you in the next video.